And so there's three entrepreneurial traits that show up in many founders. Okay. And of these three attributes, there's always a predominant, there's a secondary, and I actually wrote about this in one of my books that, good entrepreneurs get one of them. Great entrepreneurs get two of them. But the brilliant entrepreneurs get all three. It's less than 1% of the entrepreneurs can hit all three. But the three attributes are: one, you have the visionary, right? This is the person who can see around corners. Then you have the entrepreneur who's the operator, right? And then you have the entrepreneur who's the people person.
Dr. Tony, you are very welcome to the ScaleX Insider podcast. I'm absolutely delighted and thrilled to have you on the show today.
Oh, this is exciting for me. I can't wait.
Brilliant. Well, look, we've had great fun and a great conversation offer, so I'm really looking forward to this one on air. So and we're very aligned in this, our vision is to inspire, connect, and enable millions of ambitious leaders of small to medium-sized enterprises to scale with purpose. So, Dr. Tony, what does scaling with purpose mean to you?
We are very much aligned with this. And when you think about that, and I am a little bit of a word nerd, so I have this love-hate relationship with words, being dyslexic. And so when I hear you ask this question, what does it mean to scale with purpose? I start looking at the words on this, and I'm thinking, okay, this is actually a profound question. I know you've probably asked this 200, 300, 1,000 times, but when I hear this, I really start thinking, okay, to scale means to grow, and sometimes to grow with speed. And then to do that with purpose is to really ask the question, why? To what purpose, to what end? And when I apply that to myself, when I look at myself, I go back to something that Howard Schultz, the founder of Starbucks, when he wrote his very first book, talking about the early days of Starbucks, he had this quote in the book. He told all of his baristas, he calls them partners. He told all of his partners, he said, look, at the end of the day, we got to remember one important aspect, and that is we're not in the coffee business serving people. We're in the people business serving coffee. And that principle has so landed with me in my life that ultimately, at the end of the day, I think that principle transcends every business that's out there. We're all in the people business. And so my higher calling has been to help people be better people, meaning that how do I help people grow? How do I help them become their best version of themselves? And intrinsically, we all have this need to, quote unquote, grow or scale, right? And so for me, this is a very personal, almost missional journey that I've been on to help individuals personally, professionally, and organizationally be the best version of themselves so that they can scale, to use your terminology, to grow and to be the best version, whether that's personally, whether that's professionally, or whether that's organizationally. So it is a very aligned statement for me. It is really the center cut of who I am and what I do. My day job and my off hours and everything I do is really aligned around this.
Love that. We're all in the people business.
Yeah.
Let's never forget that.
Absolutely.
Just staying on this for a moment, given the work that you do, where do people get stuck the most?
Where do they get stuck the most?
In the context of their context of their desire to grow, because I agree with you. I feel we have this innate desire to grow. Unfortunately, we also have this desire to stay comfortable and to stay the same, to not change.
Right.
The minute we feel that discomfort, there's a tendency to retreat, even though we have this burning desire to grow. Yeah. So where do you feel people, given the work that you do, Tony, where do they get stuck the most?
That's so profound. The more I study people, and my doctorate is in organizational intelligence, and so technically, I'm an organizational behavioralist, which means I get to watch people for a living and it's not creepy, right? So my job is to watch people and study people, right? Airports are like nirvana for me. And when I study people, when I observe what, when people get stuck and when they start to drift off course and everything, um, you've hit on something pretty important. I mean, we like the safety and we like the certainty of life, right? And we really enjoy that aspect of that comfort. But at the same time, we're having to deal with this. But how do I do something else? How do I do more with that? And often what gets people stuck, Brendan, is that they're trying to solve a problem. Do I do this or do I do that? I've had this conversation with my daughter who, we talked earlier, she's a famous artist and entrepreneur, and she will call me sometimes and says, Dad, I'm really wrestling with this. I feel like I'm quote unquote stuck. I can't decide, should I do this or should I do that? And what happens, Brendan, is that we've been raised through our educational system and into the marketplace to be really smart problem solvers, right? And so we have been taught and we've been trained to be really smart problem solvers. And where we get stuck is we see all of life as a problem. But in some cases, Brendan, it's not a problem, it's a polarity. It's a tension that needs to be wrestled with. But we get stuck because we're like going, I don't know what to do. Is it this or is it that? And in life, sometimes it's either or. But sometimes it's both and. And that's where we get stuck. We get stuck when we're trying to navigate two interdependent values, two things that are really important. I've got a client right now in the energy business. In the energy business, safety is paramount. Everything they do has to be run through the lens of how do we keep people safe. But at the same time, they're in the marketplace and publicly traded and they have to grow. And so there's this tension. Hey, you want us to be safe, but you want us to go fast? Pick one. And in reality, Brendan, it is not pick one. It is yes and. And so how do I wrestle with the tension? And so we get stuck many, many times trying to solve a problem. And in reality, it's not a problem. It's a tension. And we have to be able to wrestle with the tension, or what I call the messy middle of this tension, to be able to move forward. And that often is one of the biggest sticking points. I see it all the time with my clients, in the marketplace with my friends. It's like they're trying to do this either or, and it's not an either or. It's a both and. And it freaks them out when I say that because they'll ask me all the time, what should I do? And I'll say, yes.
Yes, we want the prize without having to experience the discomfort of moving away from what is deemed as safety and certainty to actually get the prize. So hence this ongoing friction. I'm glad I posed that question. It was a little bit off script, but it actually segues really nicely into the fact that what we're talking about here at the very core is people who are leading businesses, people who are serving an organizational vision within those businesses to ultimately serve others in the context of solving a bigger problem. And I'm a big believer. We actually open up chapter 3 of our own book, the people-focused chapter, with the Zig Ziglar quote, you don't build a business, you build people, and people build the business. And I get a real sense... Zig quotes. Oh, yeah. Brilliant. It's
Zig's from Dallas.
There we go.
Dallas. Last session he ever recorded live, I sat on the front row, and I have the DVD somewhere, and he actually puts his hand on my shoulder and calls me out by name in the last session he ever recorded live. And I'll never forget that. I mean, he is so profound in saying it is all about building the people, right? And when I read that, I'm like, we're going to be best friends. I can tell right now. We're going to be best friends.
Well, that's wonderful. I didn't appreciate just your admiration for Zig and actually the proximity there to Zig. Your work clearly is very aligned to that quote then, but where do you feel many founders really get this wrong?
Oh, what a what a profound question. Okay, so founders, and we do a lot of work in my day job. We do a lot of work with founders. As a matter of fact, over the holiday, and we're recording this over the holiday break, and over the holiday, I don't know if I'm a typical nerd, but how I spend my holiday is writing academic papers, and so it's just like I'm just totally nerded out. And so for the last year, we've been doing a CEO study, a global CEO study. My research partner in Nashville, Tennessee, and I, Dr. Jana Roberts, and I have been doing a study on CEOs. And of all of the 120 plus CEOs that we've been studying, a large portion of them are founders. Okay. And so we've been doing a deep dive. We've been looking at some of the tensions that they struggle with, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, along the way. And the paper will come out next year. But I spent the holidays writing 44 pages of academic nerdy, data stuff. And so this is a very timely question for me. When we talk about founders, often founders are, and I'm broad stroking here, but often founders are very entrepreneurial. Okay. And so there's three entrepreneurial traits that show up in many founders. Okay. And of these three attributes, um, there's always a predominant, there's a secondary, and there's always one that needs to be developed, right? I actually wrote about this in one of my books that good entrepreneurs get one of them. Great entrepreneurs get two of them. But the brilliant entrepreneurs get all three. And it is so rare. It's less than 1% of the entrepreneurs can hit all three. Typically you get one, or typically you get two. But the three attributes are: one, you have the visionary, right? This is the person who can see around corners. They're having conversations about stuff, and you and I are sitting around going, no way. And they're having these conversations. They're the visionary, right? Then you have the entrepreneur who's the operator, right? They're the ones who stay up all night writing code, and they know how to run the thing, whatever it is, right? And then you have the entrepreneur who's the people person. This is the person who can inspire, engage, and lean into and get the people part. Of those three attributes, which one do you think most entrepreneurs um, need help with the most? I don't know. Just throw it out. What do you think?
I'm gonna bet all my chips 100% on the people part.
If we were playing poker and you went all in, you would have a good bet right there, because it's not something that just naturally comes out in many people. Now, some people are very charismatic and they can do that. And sometimes you find a visionary who's charismatic. And so you get the vision and you get the people. But if they don't get the operator in there, poof, it's going to go down pretty quick. And so it's the combination. Um, Often it's the visionary or the operator, that's the primary, and the secondary, and it's typically the people part that struggles. Now, it doesn't mean they don't like people, although sometimes there's history and autobiographies out there of some pretty famous entrepreneurs, and you would read it and you would question, do they actually like people, right? And we've probably all read some of those autobiographies. And at the end of the day, just by sheer force and will, they're able to drive something and get something done. And then somebody comes along and says, hey, maybe we should take care of the people. And they're going, oh, okay, I'm fine, take care of the people. But it's the people side of the business. And so where most founders struggle is not understanding, one, regardless of what they make, buy, borrow, sell, or service, they're in the people business. And they're really good at looking around corners and seeing what's going to come next. It's like, hey, I think one day we can do away with taxi cabs, and I think people will get in cars with strangers. What? Who would think of that? Somebody had this vision to do that. Well, he was a great coder. He could write the code and he can come up with the idea and look around the corner. But you know what? History tells us, not a fantastic people person. And matter of fact, it's well documented that he was not a fantastic people person, and he had a certain way of doing it, and it kind of burned the place to the ground. And so they had to bring somebody in there who could. So, it's the people side of not recognizing that we're in the people business that causes founders the most challenge, especially when they have to hit the gas. I've got one client right now, founder led. He's grown it to a fantastic size, and now he wants to quote unquote scale. And so the executive leadership team has come to me and they said, "Hey, look, we just did an M&A deal and we doubled our size overnight. And we're not even 30 days into this, and we're already feeling the pressure of scaling." And often, Brendan, that is because the culture is what drives all of this, right? Culture is made up of the people. And because they didn't put the culture in place correctly to scale, then they hit the gas, and that big engine culture, it's got a little water in it, and it's just sputtering, and it's not hitting on all cylinders. And what they find is they have to muscle it, and they have to push it in order to get it to do what they want it to do. And that creates tension, and it creates all these things. And normally something breaks, and when something breaks, that's when I get a phone call.
I'm so glad I asked that question. Um, you mentioned Howard Schultz earlier. Has he all three?
You know what? He's probably as close of an entrepreneur that I've come in contact with. Um, you know, from a visionary standpoint, seeing around the corners, he certainly caught the first wave of, you know, what's called the third place, the coffee, you know, little shop around the corner. He certainly 40, 50 years ago certainly saw around the corner for that. And so yeah, I think if you sit down and really look at it, Brendan, I think that's a good example of somebody who gets about as close to all three. And I'll tell you, from the people side, every time he's left and they've put another CEO in his place. Matter of fact, we talk about this in the my class that I teach at university. This is one of the case studies. Is that every time they put a CEO in place after he's left, they've always put an operator in place, right? And so again, they've put that leader in place who's very tactical and very transactional. And they want to, matter of fact, I think the very first one was a McKinsey dude, if I remember correctly. And that's all about how do we streamline this? How do we make this more efficient? Forgot about the people. And it crashed. And of course, Schultz comes back in and starts pumping up the people. And so it's been very documented that every time he's left and they put someone in, if they didn't focus on the people, it failed. Now they have somebody in there now that came from Chipotle, and Brian is a very culture forward people person. And so he will probably have the most positive impact. The jury's still out, but he's certainly making some very positive impact. I've known his second in charge at Chipotle for 15 years, and that is a very culture first, people first organization. So I think that they finally got somebody in there who gets close to all three also.
Just on the same note, and you mentioned autobiographies of famous leaders out there. If you were signposting our listeners to one autobiography, or certainly one leader who's an exemplar, who really exudes an understanding of all three, who would you signpost people to?
Well, okay, so I'm a little biased on this. Okay, so certainly Schultz would be on that list, and I've read his, and it's fantastic. Truett Cathy at Chick-fil-A, the restaurant in the United States, which dominates. When I say dominates, it's not even the same category. I mean, they have one primary item on their menu, and that's chicken, right?
Well, they've just
And
arrived.
you,
They just arrived in Northern
I,
Ireland about
I
six
know,
months
and I'm
ago.
so excited.
Well, it's incredible because it's in an Apple Green service station, and people, you can only access it on one side of the motorway, and people are driving, like,
Yeah,
20 miles out of their way to circle back to go to the Chick-fil-A, and the
yeah.
queues in Apple Green are phenomenal
It
out the
is. It's
door for Chick-fil-A. So they're
it,
clearly doing something right.
they are doing something well, and they do that in 6 days of the week, right? And so I would say that Truett Cathy, who started that, and he's now turned it over to, once he passed away, his sons took it over. But they get very close to all three. Certainly, they lean heavily on the people, and from an operations standpoint, they get that very well. Visionary seen around the corners. Sometimes, it's interesting, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this because you deal with a lot of people. But when we talk about the visionary, the person who can see around the corners, um, I've often put those people into categories of what's the next best thing, and what's the next thing that everybody needs to think about. But Brendan, I'd be curious on your thoughts on this because it seems like sometimes the visionary is the person who can see around the corner and say, maybe there's not a next best thing. Maybe this is the best thing, and we just need to stay with this best thing a little bit longer. Because I think a lot of times change is just change because we feel like we need to change. But for example, and again, I have spent a lot of time in hospitality, so I draw a lot of inspiration from hospitality. I think everybody should spend a portion of their career in hospitality serving other people. But when you look at the most successful, um, their innovation is really keeping it simple and not overcooking it. You know, metaphorically speaking, not overcooking it. I mean, when you look in the States at restaurants like In-N-Out Burger, okay, wildly successful, family owned, founder, second generation led, billions and billions and billions of dollars, but they have like one item on their menu. How many patties would you like on your hamburger? And that's it. And they do it really well. Would you like fries with that? Oh, no fries. Okay. And that's it. Chick-fil-A, they serve chicken, um, and it's the simplicity. I can make the same argument with Starbucks. Howard Schultz said, and I have his book on my shelf. He said in his first book, we will never serve food in Starbucks because it takes away from the aroma of the coffee. Well, if you go into a Starbucks now anywhere around the world, there's food there because they've become cafes and bistros. But also part of that got them in trouble along the way because they got away from the simplicity of what it is that they do. So sometimes I'm curious, can a visionary sometimes not be the person who says maybe this is the simplest thing?
I have never heard it couched like that before. So you've really made me think here, because typically when we talk about entrepreneurial visionaries, we're thinking of the Elon Musks who's pushing
Yeah,
boundaries, who is,
yeah,
building rockets, breaking them, building them again, breaking them, building them
yeah.
again, then catching them as they come back down to earth with chopsticks, and wanting to get people onto Mars and colonize it, and the Steve Jobs of this world, who ever thought about having the 1,000 songs in your pocket. And
Right.
so typically visionaries, as I've always translated it, are those people who bring us something new, as opposed to actually being disciplined enough to consistently deliver um, something that is the same. And having that discipline, I feel, has never been associated with being a visionary. But actually, if I go back to our own teachings on this, we always say simple scales, complex veils. And
Right.
in from that perspective, actually, you have brought home a really, really important point here, because entrepreneurialism typically is associated with bringing something new. And what ultimately I find catches entrepreneurs out is that they're always chasing the shiny new thing. They're
Right.
always chasing something that is different from what they currently have, because they get bored very quickly with what they currently have. And I
Correct.
feel that you've really amplified an important point here of successful scaling leaders actually have the discipline to stick to what is working, as opposed to constantly getting um, caught by actually chasing the next new shiny thing, the next fad. If you think of kind of the wonderful late great Charlie Munger, who
Yeah.
just talked about the great investors are boring investors because they just are disciplined to leave their
Right.
money in for an extended period of time when
Right.
others are taking money out, putting it into the latest new thing, Bitcoin, whatever it may be, whilst the successful disciplined investors actually are the boring investors, but ultimately outperform the market longer
Yeah,
term.
I think society probably helps us dictate who we call visionary because we tell the stories about catching a rocket with chopsticks, which, by the way, is so cool. I mean, who thinks of that,
It
right?
is.
All right, who thinks of that? But also, to your point, you know, Chick-fil-A has quietly grown from, Truett Cathy started this when he was 40 and now is the largest in the States. If you add up the next five chicken restaurants, five chicken restaurants, total revenue, they do not equal Chick-fil-A's revenue. And so their dominance, and they do it in 6 days. And so, you know, when you think about visionary, I mean, the most exciting thing is every now and then, during the fall, they'll have a limited time offer, and they'll put pimento cheese on one of their chicken sandwiches, and it goes crazy, right? But is that a visionary because they came up with something creative, or is the visionary somebody who's able to be so disciplined that they know when to stay the course and when to chase the shiny new thing? And I think sometimes in society, Brendan, we lift up the shiny thing chasers, which we need to, but we lift up the shiny object chasers, and we herald them kind of as the hero. And this kind of goes back a little bit to the book that I wrote. We've been conditioned that way since almost the beginning of time to follow the hero.
There we go. And we could have another podcast on this because ultimately scaling businesses are boring businesses. Their processes are predictable, repeatable,
Right,
sustainable.
right,
The visionary is this exemplar of what we're all craving, which is this certainty. They're not unpredictable. There's a
right,
level of certainty in
right.
the context of the direction of travel, their ability and their disciplines in sticking to the road despite all of the noise out there, and their ability to actually put processes and systems in place that actually deliver this consistent product or service. So people people get dazzled by the shiny new things,
Yeah,
but they
right.
love the predictable. And
Well, okay,
successful scaling businesses are predictable. So
I've actually written about this, and you've hit a core psychological concept right on the head, and that is people actually, crave certainty. We want certainty. However, although we want certainty, we follow clarity. And that's the consistency that you're talking about, right? And so it was interesting several years ago. It's like 8 years ago, maybe, or oh man, it may have been 12 years ago. There was a pretty substantial research project done after one of the national elections here in the States. Um, and they were looking at, why one candidate got voted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what they discovered was that people consistently went to the polls wanting certainty. Can you tell me for certain this is going to happen? However, they ended up making their decision based off of clarity. And what came out of this is two candidates. I won't tell you who they are because it can be kind of polarizing, but two candidates. And one candidate in the course of 18 months changed their platform 8 times. And it basically, whichever way the wind was blowing, that became their new platform. This is what we're going to do. And then the next week it was, this is what we're going to do. And over 18 months, they changed their platform 8 times. And so when researchers asked them, what did this candidate stand for? The responses were all over the place. And really, no one could articulate what this person could stand for. The other candidate for 18 months had one platform, had one saying, and said it over and over and over again. And when they asked even people who did not vote for this individual, what did this person stood for? Even with disgust in their voice, they said, oh, it's this, because there was clarity. And what the research came out is, even though they walked into the polls wanting certainty, they made their decision based off clarity. And so it is a core fundamental need that we all have. And so that repeatable consistency that you talk about is so vital. Matter of fact, I refer to it as one of the disciplines in my book. I refer to it as the clarity discipline, because we need this clarity if we're truly going to have extraordinary teams.
Well, that's a beautiful segue into your wonderful book, and congratulations, your eighth book. I just mind blowing that you've written 8 books. Beyond the Leader: The 7 Disciplines That Define Extraordinary Teams. And you've written it as a fable, which I love. I'm a fan of Patrick Lencioni's work and John Gordon's Energy Bus. The 7 disciplines. What I'd love to do is a little mini masterclass, and we'll pick up other themes along the way. But you mentioned also just prior to this that Chick-fil-A built a culture to scale. So I often feel that the cultural piece is overlooked, considered the soft stuff. In fact, I was speaking with a young entrepreneur recently, a second generation leader, who said that they wanted to really double down on developing the culture of the organization.
Right.
Father had built a very successful business, but she felt that, the father had explicitly said that he's not into this culture stuff. It's all soft nonsense. He said it didn't quite put it in those terms, but it was worse.
To my week.
And I feel that this is the reason for this is because the cultural stuff is not a case of we pull this lever and we see a kind of a red light going up on the dashboard and we go, oh yes, we've pulled that lever and there's the red light going up. It's back to the Charlie Munger kind of disciplines again of investing and it compounds over time.
Yeah.
But often entrepreneurs don't have the discipline or the patience to actually see that through. What's your experience of this challenge in relation to culture? Because it's often spoke about, but I think people it's become such a platitude. I feel that people know that culture is important, but actually don't have the discipline to do what it takes to actually build scaling cultures.
It's so true. I mean, this is like a Tuesday for me, right? I mean, this is my day. I've written 2 books on this topic because it is so vital. And if I had $1 for every time someone said, I don't have time for this soft stuff, I would own an island somewhere, because and again, entrepreneurs, fast movers, hard chargers, see around corners, write the code. But the people thing, we have to deal with the people thing. And they can grow it up to a certain point, and then they realize they struggle with scaling it. And that's because they don't understand a key core concept. We talk about culture, Brendan, but very rarely do people know how culture actually works. And I think that's so foundational that when we interview people and we ask them, tell me how culture works around your place, we get this high variability. And the problem with variability in any business, especially manufacturing, variability will crush your margins. It will, run you in the ditch, and it's just a horrible thing. And so when you have so many different people with so many different ideas of how culture actually works, you're going to have a problem. And most leaders see it as the soft stuff because, 1, they don't understand how it works, and 2, we haven't done a great job of teaching it. And so this is in my class at SMU. This is one of the very first conversations that we have in class is how does culture work? And it becomes so vital. And then we teach, we call it the ODF, an organizational design framework, how you actually design organizations. And so if you take a blank sheet of paper and you just write the word culture and you put it right in the middle of that, there's a left side and a right side of culture. Okay. So culture is the engine that drives everything that goes on inside an organization. Who makes up the culture? People. People make up the culture, and culture is the engine. So here's a fact, a principle of life that everybody should know. Your organizational results, the results that you're getting today, your organization is perfectly aligned to get that result because your culture is driving those results. So the culture you have today in your organization is perfectly aligned to get the results you're getting today. Okay. So said another way, if you need to get different, faster moving results, you better look at what's driving those results. And that's the people, and the people make up the culture. So if you look at this, if you picture this on a sheet of paper, culture sits in the middle. On the right side is what culture delivers. Culture drives your system, your structure, your strategy, and your results. That's what culture drives on the right side. On the left side are the stories that fuel your culture, your purpose, your mission, your vision, and your values. Now, for years, this has become, like you said, a platitude. This is what we call them wall hangers, right? This is just stuff we hang on the walls because someone at some point said, hey, I read this book and I need a purpose, mission, vision, and values. And we hang them on the walls. The problem with that is culture is either designed or dictated. Okay. So you're either intentionally designing your culture or it will be dictated to you. So if we define culture, Dr. Howard Schein or Dr. Edgar Schein is the godfather of culture. I mean, he has done the most preeminent work. He was working on it right up until the day he passed away at 92. Um, Matter of fact, it's the text that almost all graduate level students read, and it's 500 pages of culture. And he'll be the first to tell you culture is very complex, and I don't disagree with that. However, if we had to take this and simplify it to where an entrepreneur or an independent contributor could understand it, culture is the way people think, feel, and act. Okay, now that's a broad stroke, but that helps us get into the conversation. Culture is how people think, feel, and act. Now, what happens, Brendan, is often because we don't understand how culture works, we tend to only focus on how people act. And so if I'm not getting an outcome, and so let's talk about how culture works just real quick. In your mind, envision a clock. Okay. And culture is the clock. At 12 o'clock, that's where culture starts. And culture starts with stories. Okay. We are storytelling machines. Our brain is actually designed to interpret life through the lens of story. So we take in experiences, our brain converts them to story. We take in, this is shocking, but we take in somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 stories a day. Our brain is constantly being bombarded with stories. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Stories are constantly forming. So if we move around this clock from 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock, these stories are constantly forming. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as framing our mindset. Okay. Now, our mindset, this is a beautiful place in our mind. That's where our beliefs, our values, our biases, our attitudes, all of that reside in our mindset. And that mindset, our mindset is constantly being formed by the stories that are coming in. All right. So now we have a mindset. That's at 3 o'clock. Now, if we take this and we run that down to 6 o'clock on this model, on this clock, our mindset drives our behavior. How we think drives what we do. And that's behavior. Behavior sits at that 6 o'clock on the clock. That's behavior. Now, how we think drives what we do. And then from there, 6 o'clock, we run up the clock to 9 o'clock. And right there, every time we do something, Brendan, our behavior always produces an outcome. And what sets at 9 o'clock is outcome. Outcome. Now, here's the thing. Our behavior always produces an outcome, good or bad, right or wrong. You can do nothing and you're going to get an outcome. May not be what you want, but you're going to get an outcome. Behavior always gets an outcome. It's referred to as the do-get principle, which I wish I had created that, but it's so classic. It's so great. Now, here's the catch. Once you get the outcome, culture does not stop because we go from 9 o'clock on the clock back up to, and what sets at 12 o'clock? Story. Every outcome tells a story, and that's culture. And just like the hands on the clock, Brendan, it is constantly in motion. It is constantly moving. It is constantly telling stories, forming how we think, driving our behavior, producing some kind of outcome, and telling some kind of story. And it's in constant motion. Here's the catch. Because we haven't been formally taught how culture works, we have informally been taught through our whole life, right? So social learning theory says that 70% of what we know about life, we have learned through observation, okay? So social learning theory is I learn the most in social settings just by watching other people. Now, I'd love to say as a professor, I'd love to say that, people get a lot of stuff out of my classroom and they get some stuff out of my classroom, but bottom line is from a very early age, our classroom is other people, watching other people, okay? And so what happens is we haven't formally been taught how culture works. We have, unfortunately, been informally taught how culture works, but we've only been taught part of culture. And so I say this all the time. I write about this all the time. Sometimes success can be a really poor teacher because we define success in a certain way and we go, oh, that works. So therefore, whatever got them there must be the thing that I need to do. And then when I don't get an outcome that I want, well, think about our clock. If I'm not getting the outcome I want, and remember, that's at 9 o'clock, where do you think most people tend to go work in order to change their outcome?
6 o'clock to the
That's
behaviors.
exactly right. They're going to go to the closest thing, and that is behavior. And that's because that's what we've seen growing up. Now, there's a psychological term for this. And as a parent, you've probably said it, or even as a child, you've probably heard it. And it's this, you're not getting the outcome you want. And so somebody comes to you and they say something. It can be very innocent. And they say this, hey, you're doing it wrong. Do it this way. Okay. As a parent, my youngest son, who's also named Brendan, is a competitive tennis player in high school. He'd get really frustrated and he'd miss a shot. He'd throw his racket down. And during the changeover, I'd call him over. I said, come here, come here. And I'd say, hey, you're doing it wrong. Do it this way. And of course, he would give me that teenage boy stare. I don't know if you've ever had a teenage boy stare, but it's like a laser beam that kind of goes right through your cranium and takes out a couple of people behind you, right? But he'd just look at me like, I don't know what you're talking about. And in my heart of hearts, when I said that the very first time, it was a teaching moment. But in reality, the more I say it, I had to come to this uncomfortable self-awareness that there is a razor's edge between teaching and telling. And while in my heart of hearts, when I say, hey, you're doing it wrong, do it this way, it was a teaching moment. However, the way people receive that can be different. And so what happens is when we're not getting the outcome we want, we tend to go to behavior. And anytime I come to you and say, hey, you're doing it wrong, do it this way, or some variation of that, the psychological term for that is called behavior modification. And all I'm doing is just modifying your behavior to get you to do what I need you to do in order to get the outcome that I want. Now, look, if I come to you and say, Brendan, hey, you're doing it wrong, do it this way, and I give you a list of 3 things, and you do those 3 things, and we get a great outcome, right? Now remember, on the clock, outcome sets at 9 o'clock, and every time there's an outcome, what does it do? It goes
Great
back to 12
story.
o'clock and tells a story, doesn't it? Right? And here's where we get caught. Not fully appreciating how culture works gets us caught every single time. Because if I'm your manager or I'm the founder and I come in and I say, hey, you're doing it wrong, do it this way. And I give you a list of 3 or 4 things, and you go and do those 3 or 4 things, and we get a good outcome. Well, what happens is that outcome tells a story, but it tells multiple stories. And where we skin our knee the most frequent is that I tend to only focus on one story, my story. Now, anytime an outcome tells a story, it tells one of 3 big bucket stories. That story is either going to be pleasant, unpleasant, or pending, right? Pleasant. Wow, that was great. Unpleasant. Okay, that sucked. Pending. What just happened? Right? It's going to fall into one of those big buckets. Now, if I'm the founder and I come in and I see that you're not getting the outcome that I want, and I modify your behavior, hey, you're doing it wrong, do it this way, and I give you 3 things to go do, and you go do all 3 of those things, and we get a great outcome, well, that outcome is going to tell me a story. It's either going to be pleasant, unpleasant, or pending. Now, chances are, if I told you what to do and you went and did it and we got a great outcome, that story is going to be pretty pleasant. Now, remember, at 12 o'clock on our clock, that's a story. And every story forms at 3 o'clock our mindset, our beliefs, our values, our biases. So if my story is very pleasant, my belief is what? Wow, that worked. And so my behavior, probably going to come in and pull that lever again. This is how culture works on a regular basis. Now, because most people get caught up only in their own story, and I'm not thinking about your story, I could miss and drive culture in a ditch by accident. Every time I have to come in and modify your behavior, there's a term for that in the consulting world. It's called muscling the result, right? I have to muscle it. I have to push. I have to tell people what to do. As a matter of fact, one of the leading indicators, how do you know if you're drifting off course? If I have to tell people what to do more than 2 or 3 times, something's going on. Because that means their own mindset, their own thinking is not driving the right behavior. I'm having to modify their behavior on a regular basis. And if I'm having to modify their behavior on a regular basis, you've got something in your culture that's off, and it's drift. And that's one of the very first signs of cultural drift is if I'm having to tell people over and over what to do. Now, if you are the recipient of me telling you what to do and we get a good outcome, the first time your story could be pleasant, it could be unpleasant, it could be pending. But I promise you, 2 or 3 times in, me telling you what to do, that story is going to start to drift. Every time we get that outcome, it's going to start to drift and it's going to become unpleasant. And when that story is unpleasant, that's going to form a belief. And that belief will be something along the lines of, you don't trust me, I don't have to think, you're just going to change it. Why am I here? And those beliefs are going to drive your behavior. Any one of those beliefs are going to drive your behavior, and your behavior is going to be pause, wait. The minute I walk in, I hold this belief that I'm the world's greatest list maker. This place will fall apart if I'm not telling people what to do. And the minute I see you waiting, there it happened. Confirmation bias. And now my own bias that I have toward what I do just kicks in. And now I say to myself, it must be true. I have to tell you what to do. And I double down. And that's where the toxic culture starts to come up. That's where we start to get command and control. And that's when things become out of control. So I normally get the phone call when something's broken at that one, 9 o'clock, 6 o'clock area on the clock of culture. And that's normally when I get a call to try to figure out how we got here. And how we got there, often, if we work back the clock, we can go and ask ourselves, well, what beliefs are broadly held? That's very important. But how we got there comes from the story. And we tell we tell one of three stories when every single day we tell one of three stories. We tell a story when we show up, when we speak up, and when we sync up, right? Show up is the nonverbal story, camera on, camera off, late to the meeting, on time to the meeting, facial expressions, eye rolls, nonverbal. Don't have to say any words, I can tell a story. The speak up story is the actual words that we're using, which, believe it or not, we actually live in a typing construct society, which is kind of weird. But I made a comment on campus not too long ago that I think there's a cohort entering school right now that when they come to work for you and me, they will most likely be typing more words than they speak out loud because we live in a very typing construct society, which can be challenging because the speak up story is all about the words, but what's important about the words is that words on their own, and again, I'm a little bit of a word nerd, words on their own are meaningless until we add tone and context. So when we type, we actually type in tone in our head, right? I mean, we're typing, we're going, what are you thinking, right? We're typing in tone in our head and we hit send. And that tone is no longer there. But how you read, and by the way, when we read, we also read with tone in our head in order to assign meaning to the words. And so the reason we have, 3,000 emojis on our phone is because they add emotion and they add tone, right? I had a client call me one morning, early in the morning, and they said, my day's wrecked and I need to talk to somebody. I said, okay, I've been coaching this client for a while. And they said, I just got this email, it wrecked my day. I said, okay, read me the email. So it's two paragraphs. That's all it was, Brendan. It's two paragraphs. And they read me the email. And when they were done, I'm sitting there going, oh my gosh, he talks like this. This is horrible. I can't believe somebody would do this. And I realized I was getting emotionally hijacked just listening to this email. And then it dawned on me, oh, wait a minute. They actually called me to help. And now I'm jumping into the middle of this thing. And so I'm taking some deep breaths. I'm trying to calm down. And I said, okay, do me a favor. Shoot me over that email real quick. And so they send over the email. And seriously, it's two paragraphs. I take some deep breaths and I read the email back to them. I did not change one word, one comma, nothing. Two paragraphs. The only thing I changed, Brendan, was the tone. And at the end of that two paragraphs, this CEO said to me, oh, that person would never be that nice to me. Now, I want you to, I want everybody to unpack that for just one hot second. I did not change one word, not one comma, nothing. All I changed was the tone. But yet, all the words written completely changed. Same words, different tone, different meaning. The speak up story, while it's the words that are used, often the speak up story comes from the tone and the emotion that should be attached to those words in order to tell the complete story. And often that particular story is left uninterpreted. So the show up story, the nonverbal, the speak up story, the verbal, and then the sync up story. The sync up story is interesting. It's any system, process, or policy that runs in the background that tells a story when you're not necessarily in the room. And this one's big because this is our de facto story. I'm not in the room, so I need someone to tell my story when I'm not in the room. All right, I'll leave this process or I'll leave this policy here behind. And so when I'm not here, this process or policy will tell the story of how this needs to go. HR has a lot of these, performance reviews, how we give feedback, benefits, how we pay people. These are all stories, by the way. These are all stories. The most common is your calendar. That's a system, and a meeting agenda. An agenda is a system, right? And so if an organization has, let's say an organization has 4 results, take care of your people, grow your customer base, increase the top line, and increase the bottom line. We have 4 results. But let's say that you and I have a meeting, and every week on the agenda, and the agenda could be formal or informal, right? But every week on the agenda, we only talk about one item, bottom line. That's the only item we talk about. That agenda tells you and me a story, right? And the story that it tells us, the only thing that's important is the bottom line. And so the systems, processes, and policies that you and I sync up with every single day that are telling us a story, that's the underlying foundation of culture that's always happening that nobody pays attention to, really. We encourage our clients to do a yearly sync up story audit to list all the process. And once you do it one time, which is the most excruciating part, then you go back and you ask yourself, you go back and you, what have we added to this list this year? And which of these are still telling the right story? Which of these have drifted off base? Often we put these processes in place early on and we hit play and we just let them run. And then things move forward and transform, but we never change these in the background. And so what happens, I had one client that the CEO showed up in a very engaging, positive way. And when they spoke up, they said they told stories about innovation and how we were going to be innovative, but yet there was no innovation. And when they called us in and we started looking, we looked at the individual stories, how they show up, how they speak up. When we got to the sync up story, and we started looking at all the systems and processes and policies that run behind the scenes, one of the systems running behind the scenes was actually kind of an anti-innovation system, meaning that it did not reward innovation. It actually demotivated innovation. And they're going, well, how did that happen? Right? And it's because it was something they put in place 20 years ago that they forgot about, right?
We see this so often in the context of the businesses that we're dealing with. And you mentioned something right at the outset. And we talk about your values, which ultimately the culmination of those values will the behaviors. The values that you have will actually direct the behaviors, and ultimately the culmination of all of that will inform the culture of the organization. But often we see values laminated but not lived. And I've never heard culture described like you've described it in the context of the clock, and I absolutely love that. And we see this so often that maybe innovation is one of those values, but actually, to your example, there's very little evidence of innovation in the organization, or actually when people are being innovative, the organization, the leadership jumps on people for getting things wrong. But ultimately what they were trying to do was innovate something new. So the behaviors of the leadership team are in conflict to the values that are actually prescribed on the reception wall. I feel that in the context of the 7 disciplines, we've spoken about clarity, that there should be absolute certainty in the context of the message that is being clarity in the message that's being delivered, and consistency in that message, so that everyone knows the purpose, the vision, the priorities, what we call the objectives, the key results relating to those objectives. We've spoken about another discipline, learning. Those extraordinary teams continuously learn, reflect, and improve together. So they're taking these outcomes, whether positive or negative, and reflecting on what was the behavior, what was the mindset, what was the story that ultimately drove that result, not just in the behavior. I feel that in the third discipline, we've spoken to that in the context of actually creating a safe environment for people to speak up and challenge behaviors that are leading to certain outcomes that allow us then to have these learning moments to actually frame mindsets and change the stories, which leads to the fourth discipline in terms of the connection. All of this is predicated on us actually having strong relationships within the organization. Action, I feel we've spoken about the team converting this clarity into decisive, aligned execution. Adaptability. Can you speak to the sixth and seventh, which is adaptability, and then the final discipline, which we haven't spoken about, which people, I think, can get confused about, which is celebration. So let's speak in closing to adaptability and celebration. If you feel I've wrapped up there in
Yes.
an
There's
appropriate
one, the
way.
connection discipline is somewhat novel, and I want to make sure that we talk about that because that's really, from the research, that's really probably, and you just had a fantastic guest on, Dr. Johnson, talked about connection and the importance of connection.
Absolutely.
And I mean, it was almost like it came out of one of the chapter. Our books could have been interchanged when we talk about connection and loneliness and the importance of that. There is a nuance that I want to make sure that we cover, but adaptability is really a group, a team that has the ability to ask this question: what are we holding on to too hard that may hold us back? Right? And this goes back to the learning discipline. We can actually measure the health of a team and a culture by how quickly they can learn, unlearn, and relearn. Everybody can do that, right? Brendan, everybody can learn, unlearn, and relearn. If it's done to you, we call that disruption, right? But if you're doing it on a regular basis, that reflection that you talked about, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the speed in which you're able to do that actually determines the health, the overall health of an organization. When you get to adaptability, adaptability is your ability to leverage learning and then release what it is that you're holding on to too hard that may be holding you back. It's an idea, it's a thought, it's whatever the case may be. And that adaptability comes in your ability to let go of that and navigate to a new path. That's super important. That's the short version of that. Celebration is really about celebrating not just the wins, but also the skin knees. And often, and celebration leads back to learning, by the way, because this creates a flywheel. And celebration becomes part of that learning and it leads back to learning. But often we tend to only celebrate the big wins. And, one of the questions that you and I talked about early on was, how can you tell when an organization culture is drifting? And one of the ways that you can tell is what you're celebrating. Because if you're finding that you're constantly celebrating the same thing over and over again, then you might be becoming complacent and drifting. Because celebration should be, one, celebrating the culture that you desire, but it also should be celebrating how we won. But at times it should be celebrating where we skin our knees. Now, failure is this big topic, right? And a lot of people hold beliefs around failure. Dr. Amy Edmondson's probably written the most profound research on this. And in her new book, The Right Kind of Wrong, she really talks about how we deal with failure and what it is that we need to celebrate. And so we have to understand something, that failure falls on this continuum from sloppy to planned, right? Sloppy failure is just, I'm goofing off and I did something wrong. You don't celebrate that. You correct that, you coach that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at the other end, there's almost this planned failure. In design thinking, we refer to it as iteration. How do I iterate? I design something, I test it, I put it in the market, and I iterate. It's design failure. And celebration should be, where do we win? Where do we score? All of those things, yes. But if we're not celebrating also, hey, we tried this and it didn't work, it was planned, and here's what we took away from that. If we're not doing that, we're not celebrating enough. So celebration should be, it should be linked to the culture that you desire, and it should also be linked not just to the big wins, but to where we had planned breakage. And now sometimes we'll put something in place and it breaks. It wasn't planned, but it breaks. When we discover that it breaks and then we overcome that break and we talk about that break, that is a form of celebration, but often we hide the breaks. It's like, yeah, we don't want to talk about that. It was a service failure, or whatever the case may be. And we use this word in a very negative way, and it has an impact on culture, because if we're telling stories that, oh, that thing broke, that was a service failure, if we're telling that story in a negative way, people are going to hide. But if we're telling that story in a way that it creates learning and an improvement, not denying the fact that something broke, but not hiding the fact that we had an opportunity to learn and to overcome and to get better, that's a key part of celebration. And often I think we only get celebration about 50 to 60% right inside organizations. And sometimes we just celebrate um, not enough, not enough. But I do want to circle back before we wrap up to connection, because at the center of all of this is this idea to connect, and it really comes down to this idea of leadership. Okay, so my first 5 books were on leadership, and when I started my doctoral journey, my professors asked me, what do you want to study? And so I spent a decade of my career as the chief people officer, head of HR, for 2 global companies. Okay. And one company had 60,000 people, the other company had like 5,000 people. And so there was a common theme when you deal with people, Brendan. And sometimes you get people show up in your HR office and it's like, hey, Frank's burning the place down over here. You need to go help. You need to go deal with Frank, right? And we had a term for Frank. We called Frank the brilliant jerk. Now, the reason we call Frank the brilliant jerk is because Frank's boss would always end up in my office defending Frank. Here's what they'd say: Why are you spending so much time with Frank? Look, Frank is our top producer. You know, Frank's been here 20 years. Frank is the EVP. Frank is the pick something. You know, and then I'd get the wave off and they'd say, ah, that's just how Frank is. And it was really frustrating, Brendan, because what would happen is Frank was having this impact in the culture. Frank's burning the place down, but people were making excuses for Frank because he had some level of influence or brilliance. Now, this is really tricky when Frank happens to be the founder. And I get this phone call all the time. When you have a founder who's a brilliant jerk, they can see around corners and they can operate, but they dislike people and they're toxic and they're the brilliant jerk. This is where I end up spending a lot of my work, is how do you help this? Often, I went into my doctorate and my professor said, what do you want to study? And I said, I need to help Frank. And of course, my professor said, who's Frank? And he's my imaginary person, right? And then I foolishly said this, and I think I know the answer. Now, if you ever want to get a rise out of your professors, you tell them you know the answer before you ever done any of the research. I've later learned to say, I have a hypothesis. But they said, oh, what do you think your answer is? And I said, somewhat confidently, I need to help Frank be a better leader. Because Brendan, I was convinced it was a leadership issue. And so, you go off and you spend nearly 4 years researching, writing and studying and doing all the stuff. And I was about 2.5 years in. We did a global study for global companies over the course of 2 years. And when we started doing the data, I was actually pushed back on my heels, because what I discovered is that it wasn't about leadership. It was about followership. And it kind of caught me off guard because I had spent, at that point, a large portion of my career trying to help people be better leaders. Now, don't get me wrong, being a better leader is still important, but here's what we discovered. Your leadership is actually connected to your followership. And what we found in the research is that, one, this was a big thing. For 5,000 years, we've been studying leaders. For 50 years, we've been studying followers. But we've been studying them as 2 separate constructs. You're either this or you're that. And there's been brilliant research on followership. And it's like, here you are, you're a follower. Here you are, you're a leader. And you're one or the other. One of the very first ahas that we had is that you're both and. You cannot escape the fact that leadership and followership are 2 sides of the same coin. That at any given time, you're navigating in and out of leading and following in a very fluid, dynamic motion all day long. You're not either or, you're both and always. That was aha number 1, which was kind of, okay, that kind of makes sense. I don't know why we've never thought about it that way, but a few people have. So you're both and that's number one. But number two, and what really caught us is when you're in follower mode, your follower mode actually dictates your leader mode. So if you're effective in follower mode, you're more likely to be transformative in leader mode. However, if you're ineffective in follower mode, you will be toxic in leader mode. Your leader mode is connected to your follower mode. And so your followership actually sets your leadership. So I'm sitting here trying to help you be a better leader. And in reality, I need to help you be a better follower. And for a lot of founders, that's an interesting concept. And so when we started doing the work, matter of fact, I wrote The Follower Effect 2 or 3 years ago. My publisher is re-releasing it. It's going to come out next year, but it was actually the precursor to Beyond the Leader. I talk about followership in Beyond the Leader, but the follower effect is this simple fact that at any given time, we're both and. Connection is really about knowing when to lead and when to follow, and do it effectively in both categories. How do I move in and out, in and out? It's a little bit like when you're cycling. I love to go for a bike ride on
Likewise.
my own and kind of clear my head. But if I'm riding in a group, it's referred to as a peloton, a slipstream. That person in the front, they're taking on all the wind and all the pressure, and everybody behind them get the benefit of that slipstream. They get the benefit of that. I can go fast with less energy because I'm following this person. But that person, Brendan, at the front was never, ever, ever intended to run the whole race in the front. At some point, they're going to be the hills person, and they're going to be in the front, and everybody's going to be getting the benefit of slipping in behind them. But the minute they get to the flat, that person has to come back to the back of the peloton and recover. And then the person who's the straightaway person comes to the front. And now they're the leader. And now that person gets the benefit of recovery in the back. And it's this constant motion of leading and following. That in itself is the key thing, that if I could get every person who has positional power to understand, it would absolutely change cultures around the world.
That is so profound. Practically, then, just before we move into the close, understanding this interplay between, if I'm a good follower, then it increases the probability of me being
Yes.
a much better leader. So
Yes.
an effective follower has the potential to become a transformative leader.
Correct.
How, given that the listenership to this podcast are either founders and or leaders of organizations who have ambition to scale, to become an effective follower, how should I show up, speak up, and sync up?
That is absolutely the right question. There's 3 attributes that you have to consider every single day. In follower mode, I have to be effective as an independent critical thinker. I have to be focused on the mission, and I have to be an active partner in follower mode. So to be an independent critical thinker means that I look internally first, and I ask myself, what am I holding on to before I throw something out externally? To be the independent critical thinker, there's 2 items that I always coach my leaders to think about. It's humble discernment. Think about it that way. It's humble discernment. Can I have humility and discernment at the same time to be an independent critical thinker? And now it's much more involved, but that's the short version. Mission focused means that I'm focused on the enterprise. If I'm ineffective at doing that, which, by the way, if independent critical thinker, if I'm ineffective, I become very passive. Yeah, whatever. Just tell me what to do. Or I become very fixed. Yeah, we don't do it that way around here, right? I'm not thinking independently or critically. I'm ineffective. I'm very fixed, my way or the highway. Mission focused. If I'm effective, I'm thinking about the bigger enterprise. I know there's a mission. I'm focused on the mission. If I'm ineffective, I tend to focus on myself. Yeah, this doesn't work for me. whatever the case may be. Active partner, this one's the hardest too. Active partner, even if I hold the title, if someone else has the decision and makes the decision, then I stack hands and I go. Right? Active partner is involvement. I don't have to agree, but I'm involved because a person was given the authority to make a decision. They made a decision and we go. The ineffective partner isn't an active partner. They're an active competitor. They're constantly pushing by. And here's how it manifests. And when I say this, this freaks people out a lot. They say things like, well, let me just play devil's advocate. Now, I can't tell you how many times I've been in meetings and someone said, let me just play devil's advocate. It's not 100% of the time that's an active competitor statement, but it is a high percentage of the time because people that say that frequently it's a Trojan horse. What they're trying to do is let me just play this out. Let me just be devil's advocate here. Because ultimately what I'm trying to prove is that I'm right and you're an idiot. And they're trying to slip an ego in by playing quote unquote devil's advocate. That's being an active competitor, not an active partner. An active partner is what's the bigger mission and what's going to take us off track. Independent critical thinker is what am I holding on to that may hold us back? And what might someone else be holding on to that may hold us back from the mission? The mission. But if I become an active competitor, I'm competing to get my ego, to get my decision because it works best for me. That's ineffective followership. And if you're in follower mode and you hold a positional power, when you go into leader mode, you will be toxic. You will be toxic in leader mode. And so how you follow determines how you lead.
So, so profound. The last hour and 15 has absolutely flown, Tony. Absolutely flown. I could spend another.
I spend all day with you.
Absolutely. You're delivering so much value. Your work has impacted and continues to impact tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people across the world. We have a tradition on this show to invite our wonderful guests to share with our audience 3 timeless takeaways.
I love that. And, I often think through the lens of personal, professional, and organizational. Okay. So if I was to come up with 3 takeaways, personally, professionally, and organizationally, personally, I would say the big takeaway is, be self-aware that you're both leading and following, that you're both leader and follower, and pay attention to how you follow, right? I would say that from a personal standpoint, that's the thing that you need to pay attention to. I would say from a professional standpoint, the takeaway is pay attention to the 3 stories that you tell every day. How do you show up? What story are you telling when you don't use any words? How do you speak up? What story are you telling with the words that you are saying? Because any story left uninterpreted is going to be misinterpreted, right? And then how do you sync up? What are those systems, processes, and policies that you interact with? Your calendar, the agendas that you have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I would say professionally, pay attention to what story you're telling every single day. And then organizationally, the key takeaway is your culture is either designed or it's dictated. And if you're intentional about leading the culture, it won't lead you. So how are you designing your culture in order to intentionally get the outcomes that you want, right? Because the stories that we feed into your culture, this is where most founders, Brendan, struggle, is because they become the story that feeds the culture. And when they're no longer there, that's not scalable. And so having that documented and written down like you do when you in your 10X, how are we communicating these processes and these values and what it is that makes us who we are. And most founders get in trouble because they have become the culture by de facto. And then all of a sudden they want to leave. And it's like people are going, well, what do? We always look to you to tell us what to do. And we couldn't think because the culture was not documented, it wasn't lived out, and it wasn't designed. And so, organizationally, I would say either you design your culture or it will be dictated to you.
Those are so, so powerful. Thank you. Really, really powerful. I love your structure, personal, professional, and organizational. It aligns beautifully to everything that we've spoken on the show today about. So, Dr. Tony, what is next for you? 8 books in. I suspect, given the last hour, you're not a man who's going to rest up very, very, very quickly or anytime soon. So what's on the horizon for you?
All kinds of fun things. I mean, research paper coming out next year. The next book is in the works. The working title is Follow the Leader. And it's going to be how we navigate the 4 seasons of life. A lot of it comes from the research that we're currently doing. It's there's always something going on. I know it.
Brilliant.
I love it.
Brilliant. Good on you. And you were sharing with me off air the wonderful podcast you hold with your daughter. An opportunity to continue to spend time with her and honor your tradition of the Saturday morning breakfast,
Yeah.
now delivered through the medium of a podcast. I think that's absolutely wonderful. So good on you. Look, I want to thank you for today. You have really delivered so much value. I encourage everyone to go out and get your latest book, Beyond the Leader. And if people want to find out more about all of your other work, Dr. Tony, where best to reach with you and how best to connect with you?
I think the world is connected on LinkedIn. At least sometimes it feels that way. So they can certainly find me on LinkedIn. They can find me at theencompassgroup.com or at drtonybridwell.com.
Brilliant. Well, we'll put links to both of those in the show notes. Look, once again, I want to thank you for the way you have shown up, and appreciate it's the holiday season, but the way you've shown up with such wonderful, wonderful energy today, delivering so much wisdom, so much value to our listeners. I wish you every success in everything you're doing. You're putting so much value out into the world. Please continue to grace the world with your wonderful work, Tony. Thanks for today.
I sir appreciate that. Have a fantastic new year.